In the previous video, I said that we would continue to learn about arrays in JavaScript. But later, I realized that we skipped one really important topic. What is scoping in JavaScript? Now I show one example that looks like a magic if you don't know what is scoping in JavaScript. I declare my variable that equals to 1. Then I log it to the console. So now in the console you see 1. Then I create a simple if statement that equals to true. For example, if my variable equals to 1, and now I declare a variable with the same name as we had before. But on this time, my variable equals to 2. I also logged it to the console, and now you see that I have 2 variables with the same name in my code. And it seems that I reassigned my variable that was equal to 1, and right now it is equal to 2. But how it is possible? So scoping creates its own world inside of our code with its own rules and variables. It can get access to variables from outside, but can't expose its own variables to the outside. Let's have a look at several examples to better understand how it works. Let's start from declaring x that is equal to 5 in the global scope, and then we log x to the console. So this is a global scope. This is how we usually declare our variables. And as expected, we can access those variables and see the result in the console. Now let's create a local scope and let's try to get access to the same variable in a local scope. To create a local scope, we need to use curly braces. So every time when you see some code inside of curly braces, this is a new local scope. For example, I can use if statements, but the same local scopes you might create with for loops or while loops. So I wrote that if true, which is always equal to true, then we log x to the console. And this is also what we did, and as expected, we can get access to this variable, and again in the console we see 5. On this time, let's create another local scope, and there we will declare a variable with the same name as x. But on this time, our x will be equal to 10. So now I created another local scope, and there I declared x, and as you see in the console, this x equal to 10. As I said, when you create a new scope, this is a new world with its own rules and variables. Our previous x is unchanged. I logged x to the console again, and I did it in a global scope. We can understand it because we don't have any curly braces. And as you see, our last line equals to 5. On this time, let's also add a line x++ in our local scope. In my second local scope, after I declared my x, I increased it by 1 and then I logged it to the console. And now you see that only one line have been changed, so it means that when you create a new variable within a local scope, you affect only this variable. Our change x++ influence only this area inside of curly braces, because we declared x in this local scope. Now let's create a new local scope with the same line x++. Is very important difference. I created a new local scope that is very similar to our previous one, but I didn't declare x again as I did it in my previous local scope. And what we see that I increased x by 1, and then when I logged it to the console, we see 6 as a result. And then in my global scope, I also logged x to the console, and you see that my local scope affects the variable that we declared in our global scope. We also might declare a very similar local scope where we reassign x to a new value, for example 1. And again, as you see, I didn't declare x within this local scope, so it found x from the global scope that we declared in our third line, and it changed the value to 1, and then you see that 2 times when I logged x to the console, I have a value of 1. So again, this local scope affects the variable from global scope. But I highlighted both these actions with yellow color because it works only if we use let instead of const. So as you remember, const add an additional protection that prevents a variable from reassignment. So it means that if I change this keyword let to keyword const, now I have an error because both these local scopes are trying to reassign a const value of x to a new one. So I can comment out them, and you see that we don't have any errors anymore. Both these actions are legal only if we use let instead of const. Now let's create a new local scope where we declare a value of y. So now I created a local scope and I declared y that is equal to 1, and as expected, I can access this variable within this local scope. But if we try to get access to the same variable in our global scope, JavaScript throws an error because this variable can be accessed only within this border. Now in my last console log, I tried to access the variable of y, but as I said, JavaScript throws an error. And if we look at the description of this error, we see that y is not defined. It means that JavaScript don't know about any y on the line 31. All variables that are created in a local scope, they can't be exposed to the outside. And the same, if I try to create a new local scope that will log y to the console, we will also have the same error because again, as you see, y is declared only within this box. And when we create a new local scope, this local scope is not within our previous local scope. And as you see, we have the same error because JavaScript can't access to the variable that was defined within a local scope. One more interesting feature is that we can have nested local scopes. For example, let's start from declaring a local scope within our global scope where we declare x that is equal to 10 and then we log x to the console. So at this point, we have a variable x that is accessible only within these curly braces. Now let's create a new local scope that will be inside of our previous local scope. We create nested local scopes and there we declare a variable of y and log it to the console. To create a nested local scope, I will use the same if statement inside of our previous if statement. So as you see, right now we have a local scope and it exists in our previous local scope. There we have y that is equal to 1, and when we log y to the console, we see that it equal to 1 and we don't have any errors. As I said, our x is accessible within these curly braces. So it means that we can get access to this x in our nested local scope. I will log it to the console. And as you see, it works fine. But if we try to log y to the console from our first local scope, we'll have an error. And this is because our y is accessible only within this local scope. But our console.log line is outside of this local scope. In our code, I logged y to the console, but as you see, this is outside of the y's scope. This is the reason why we have reference error that y is not defined. And again, let's create a new local scope that is outside of our nested local scopes. I comment out this line, and now I can create a new if statement. As you see, this local scope can create variables with the same name and we don't have any conflicts. I hope that now you understand how scoping works in JavaScript, and in the next video we will learn about functions in JavaScript.